It's The World This Week. 7 days, 4 Paris-based correspondents, 1 hour. The World This Week in partnership with the Daily Beast. Christopher Dickey, foreign editor, is here. How are you, sir?
Always glad to be here.
Always glad to have you. Always glad to also have Lila Jacinto, senior editor at France24.com, who cracks the whip upstairs. That's what's said. Thank you for being with us. Thanks as well to Angela Diffley of the English language service of sister station Radio France International. It's a bit of a reunion, Angela, because we have a visitor from out of town, Sonia Dridi, the Washington correspondent for France 24 in French. Nice to see you.
Nice to see you again.
Thanks for dropping in.
Thank you.
The World This Week on Facebook and Twitter. #World This Week. Angela Merkel warned the German parliament ahead of the EU summit that's just concluded that Europe's destiny was at stake, with this battle over borders becoming a battle of values. Now, as that summit was winding down, France was starting to pay a national tribute to a woman who incarnated what the EU is all about. The remains of concentration camp survivor Simone Veil and her husband Antoine lying in state at Paris's Holocaust Memorial ahead of their Sunday internment at the Panthéon, where the heroes of the Republic are buried. Simone Veil, who lost her parents at Auschwitz, would go on to live in Germany, where her husband was posted for work. She'd be a magistrate, the health minister, who pushed through the legalization of abortion in 1974, and the first president of the European Parliament. When you look at France's attention, Sonia Dridi, which is focusing on Simone Veil for this Sunday, and you see how divided Europe is today, the contrast is a stark one.
Yes, and I think it's worrisome. I think a lot of people today say that Simone Veil would not have liked to see that. And coming from the US too, I think it's the summit on the migrants was also very important to see that Europe is trying to work together, to work, as a community, because of course, in the US president try also to divide Europe in a certain way, and took Germany as a target. He often criticized Angela Merkel on Twitter. There is some rumors now that he tried to convince Emmanuel Macron maybe to leave the EU to have a better commercial deal. So I think coming from the US, I think it's an important symbol and image to see that Europe, the different leaders of Europe are trying to work together on such an important issue.
Trying to work together, and after a lot of political grandstanding in the build-up to this summit, European leaders pulling another one of those trademark all-nighters with a compromise where they agree to share out refugees on a voluntary basis, create so-called controlled centers inside of the European Union to process asylum requests. Critics say controlled centers, it amounts to detention centers, but even the leader of Italy's populist coalition, he signed on the dotted line.
I would say, overall, we are satisfied. It was a long negotiation process. But today, Italy is no longer alone, and that's what we asked for.
So there you see Giuseppe Conte saying he's changed the conversation in Europe. Of course, I've read other reports saying, well, he had to cave in during this summit and agree to, keep it on a voluntary basis, whether or not the others will take in more of his migrants.
Well, I don't think it was ever going to be a perfect summit for anybody. It was billed as being a high drama and might even lead to the collapse of the European Union. The hype before it was gigantic. The Italians got something. They got a lot more money for the processing of asylum seekers. We don't know yet where these centres will be. There will be some within Europe. It's likely that some of them will be in Italy. There will be some in Africa, the disembarkation centres. We don't know where they will be either. Neither do we know what will happen to migrants who are refused asylum status. That said, I think Europe does edge each time closer and closer towards, or further and further away from chaos, maybe that. There isn't an easy solution, and I don't think Europe should be too berated for not snapping its fingers and coming up with something great. Even people who have the same hard-line stance on migrants, such as Viktor Orban in Hungary, who has been, in many ways, the spokesperson for the Eastern European so-called Visegrad states who are very anti-accepting migrants. He, in many ways, shares the views of Salvini, the hardline interior minister in Italy. But because of their geographical positions, the priority for Hungary is keep migrants out. The priority for Italy is everybody share them. We can't deal with everyone arriving. There isn't a straightforward solution. Many questions are thrown by this. We've moved a little further away from chaos. And, of course, Merkel, we have to see whether her rebellious interior minister will buy the deal on asylum seekers moving around Europe.
Yeah, we're going to talk about that in a moment. That's important, the domestic politics in Germany. But there is a sense that when push comes to shove, Christopher Dickey, rather than break it all up, Europeans prefer what they call the Brussels fudge, something that's perhaps a little light on substance, but they're better together in the end.
Well, I think that's true. But on this particular issue, I think the first thing you have to understand is that the crisis was in 2015. It's not today. The immigration that we're talking about is down 90%. We're looking at problems that were created when there was a massive flow of refugees from Syria in the middle of war. Right now, that war is being won by Bashar al-Assad, and it will soon be over to all intents and purposes. So all of that is changing. What has happened, though, as a result of politicians grandstanding like Viktor Orban or the head of the CSU in Germany or Salvini in Italy or Kurz in Austria, is that they play on that sense of panic, really, that seized Europe in 2015, and they use that to push populist, racist, xenophobic policies that they use to inspire fear among their constituents, even when there's no reason to be afraid. That's really what we're looking at. So is it surprising they could fudge some kind of solution to a problem that's solving itself? No, it's not surprising.
Well, I mean, the problem is Europe is still dealing with the large influx that came in from 2015. So, right, the numbers are down. But, I am dealing with, for instance, the countries on the supply side. And increasingly, so yes, the numbers are down, but because of my language skills, I'm still helping with translations of people who came in with the 2015 migration, who should be sent back, and and so this crisis is not over, and they're circulating around Europe. So there's still a problem. The demographic, the supply side, that is not going to end. The Western routes are is being used much more. So we have this prospect of a demographic bomb in sub-Saharan countries. So this is definitely an issue that has to be dealt with. And I kind of share both of your analysis that, yes, Europe did come together. This is not at all an easy issue to deal with, but Europe patched together, especially since, Donald Trump seems to be taking such pot shots at this bloc.
Taking such pot shots at the bloc. And again, at the end, there is this fudge. We're going to see what happens when Angela Merkel sits down with her hardline interior minister, whether she has resolved the crisis within her cabinet. Horst Seehofer, the head of the sister party of her CDU, the CSU from Bavaria. And let me read to you this opinion survey, Leila. It's by pollsters from Forza last week. They asked Bavarians, what's the biggest problem facing? 39% said the CSU, and 30% said refugees. So is that gonna help concentrate the minds in Seehofer's case, or encourage him to grandstand even more?
Well, I mean, he's made conciliatory noises right now. And so we're all hoping that this coalition holds. But, the fact that the CSU itself is a problem, which really goes to show how the rhetoric on this issue can absolutely be pumped up. So, you know, one hopes that with this deal coming through, I mean, what I would ideally like to see is that the rhetoric on immigration goes back to pre-2015
Because the Bavarians
levels.
vote in October. There could be a lot of grandstanding between now and then.
Yes. So every election means, you know, this migrant issue will be pumped up again. But really what what I would like to see is, as I said, going back to 2015 levels, we are all immigrants here, you know, so at which point the discourse tips so badly in this populist vein?
Yeah, I don't think it's fair to suggest always that it's a top-down thing and that unscrupulous leaders use public opinion to turn them against migrants. I do think you have to look at what happened in Germany, where refugees were welcomed or asylum seekers were welcomed with open arms. Then you had a few terrorist attacks. And there is... of course, those
Angela,
things are not automatically associated.
How many people were involved with the terrorist attacks?
I entirely agree.
I mean, really, how
many
people?
What you or I
about
think.
The number of people that are around this table were involved with the terrorist attacks.
Well, obviously.
The number of people who were allowed into Germany was 1 million people.
Yes.
1 million people. This is exactly what I'm talking about. This is using anecdotes to smear entire populations.
No, it's not important what you or I think. It's important what the voters of Germany...
Well, do you think they just get these ideas out at the top of their heads? Do you think they just sort of sit around and think that?
I think they feel increasingly that elites, and I'm obviously not alone in thinking this, elites tell them what to think, and we journalists are among those elites that tell them what to think. When you had things like Cologne, where the press hushed up stuff, it made people react negatively, and it's not as straightforward as all of that.
And also, you know, just one thing, you know, because I report in places where, you know, people look at me and they're waiting for me to finish my interview to ask, oh, where were you born? How did you make it to the US? And the number of my friends, Afghan friends, for instance, we are increasingly facing this problem of people who should not be coming in illegally, just doing that. And the number of times I have to keep repeating the message, do not come illegally. There is no need for you to come in illegally. You're not going to have this dream destination if you do this. But it's amazing how this message does not get translated. So on the field, I am constantly having this, you know, it's not like the solution is a fortress, but simply do not risk your lives. And there are many people, and, you know, Indian Americans, Afghan Americans, we're constantly having to say, whoa, I can't just have this entire family here. I'm not anti-immigration. But some of this message of just getting onto the boat and coming, that is not the way.
And if I can add something, I think I agree also with Angela in the sense that it's very important that this summit also happens, because the public opinion are very worried. And I left France now maybe 7-8 years ago to report abroad, and I'm very worried to see how to see how the society is more and more divided. I mean, we talk about the US, but
it feels more polarized than when you left.
It feels much more polarized. I see much more people worried about the influx of migrants that maybe a few years ago I don't think they will have been so worried, or like people will tend to go closer to the far right. I mean, we see also the same elements here that we saw in the US. And so I think it's very important that to reassure the public opinion, because even if the influx of migrants is much less important, I mean, we have a huge crisis in Libya. You have so many refugees in Lebanon, and that's also an issue. I mean, some of them will try to come again and again in Europe. So even though it's less important than in 2015, the crisis is huge. And so we have to, I mean, the public opinion needs to be reassured.
But it's 90% less important than 2015.
Yeah,
I mean,
but
that's a significant number.
It's the feeling of the people.
I think that
Sony's point is that it's the perception of it.
Perception, exactly.
But how are perceptions made? Is it because people are living next to migrants who are treating them horribly? Actually, if you look at the people who vote against migrants, vote for hardline positions, they're not usually the people who are living near migrants. They're the people who don't know any migrants at all.
Of course.
Of course.
No. I mean, of course, that's a phenomenon. But the result is like you have societies who are more and more divided. You have some people who don't know any migrants but are still very afraid. So I think it's just important to be that Europe is trying to work together and do something and to show that to have maybe less people, you know, who are going to go toward the far right because when they are fed up and, you know, it's
I agree. I agree. I'm not saying that Europe shouldn't do anything.
Mm-hmm.
I think that what they did this time is a good first step. It is a fudge. It is a symbol that's important to those people who feel insecure. I agree with all of that. I'm just saying, for those of us who are sitting around here, we need to keep in mind the actual facts we're dealing with, not just the emotions. Emotions can be facts too, but they're not the only facts.
And will it be enough to stop the slanging between France's president and Italy's interior minister? Case in point, on the eve of the EU summit, Matteo Salvini revisiting Emmanuel Macron's Tuesday visit to the Vatican and asking in a tweet, but who's ever seen someone caress the Pope? Yeah, there were images of Macron after their encounter. They even embraced on the cheek. Hopefully we'll show you those images. Lila Jacinto, does Salvini have a point there? What did you make of that visit to the Vatican by Macron?
Well, they seem to... The discourse in France, of course, we have to give our audiences some background. You know, the fact that the French president went and saw the Pope and accepted this honorary, I forget what.
Honorary canon of
Right, you know, which raised eyebrows because France's laïcité, you know, secularism is very important. But then he seemed to have a real rapport with the Pope. The meeting went on for a long time, and he definitely...
So can you caress the Pope?
He broke protocol.
He broke protocol, okay.
However, as an issue, I don't really have a problem with breaking protocol.
All right.
Well, maybe he's been hanging out with Trump too much. You know? I mean, that's sort of...
What did you think when you saw those images, Angela?
He does put a lot of faith in body language and touchy-feely stuff. We had the handshake, which he said afterwards was really important. He does a lot of this touching.
Oh, Michelle Obama, who touched the Queen, was like, seriously, do we need to discuss this? Let's move on.
Well, we're not going to move on quite. We're not quite finished with the EU summit. There is one other topic, Brexit. In an attempt to get some control back over the talks, Theresa May reportedly warning EU leaders during their dinner on Thursday night that if they push too hard and Britain is crashing out of the bloc without a deal next March, then the ability to share intelligence and solve serious crimes and prevent militant attacks is, quote, being put at risk. The Irish Prime Minister rebutting that they were expecting progress at this summit, but there hasn't been. A sentiment shared in a quite blunt fashion by the European Commission president.
Are you worried also about the lack of progress on Brexit?
Yes.
Why? What do you want Theresa May to do?
I don't have to lecture Theresa May, but I would like our British friends to make clear their positions. We cannot go on to live with a split cabinet.
We can't go on to live with a split cabinet. There's fresh rumors that Boris Johnson may be out as foreign secretary.
That he might resign.
Is Jean-Claude Juncker saying that there's this split cabinet? There's the feeling that I don't know, is the bargaining actually begun? Is the real negotiation begun or not?
Well, there's this big meeting next week in Chequers, the Prime Minister's country residence, where the British cabinet will hammer it out. It seems breathtaking that we are this far into the progress, and we're not talking about Britain or Parliament or the government, not even the cabinet know what they want or can decide. And there are fears now that they will eventually hammer something out, which they themselves agree on, with maybe one or two resignations. It might be something like a single market only on goods, and it will be immediately rejected by the EU 27 because that is cherry picking. So it seems extraordinary that next week is the big make or break for the British cabinet, and all they will come up with, at best, is likely to be something which will be immediately rejected. The big problem is Ireland, and no concrete
there'll be no fudging on that one.
Proposal has still been put forward, so nothing can advance until that is fixed.
Wow. The reaction over Twitter by the President of the United States to the Supreme Court's decision to uphold the latest version of his a travel ban affecting mostly Muslim countries. Conservative Justice Anthony Kennedy siding with the 5-4 majority on that ruling. He's often proved in other times to be the swing vote on the bench, like with the legalization of same-sex marriage. On Wednesday, the 81-year-old announced his upcoming retirement that almost immediately triggered rallies and protests in Washington and elsewhere. And for good reason, the Republicans want to move fast before midterm elections where they could lose their majority in the Senate and the ability, of course, to keep a firm hold on confirming Supreme Court justices.
The Senate stands ready to fulfill its constitutional role by offering advice and consent on President Trump's nominee to fill this vacancy. We will vote to confirm Justice Kennedy's successor this fall.
Christopher Dickey.
What a creepy, hypocritical slug that guy is. I mean, he's the one who prevented Obama 10 months before the elections from even getting hearings on Judge Garland, who Obama wanted to name to the Supreme Court. And now he's saying that they've got to not only have hearings, they've got to have the approval before the midterm elections. His rationale with Obama was the American people should have a voice. Now the American people should not have a voice. This is clear hypocrisy. And frankly, once it happens, because it will happen, we're going to have a situation where Donald Trump is in charge of the executive, he has a supine Congress, and he will have a supine Supreme Court. And we will essentially move from the American government to the Trump regime. This is a very dangerous time, and that's what people were protesting.
The Trump regime, there are still checks and balances in the U.S. system.
What are those?
I mean,
what are those checks and balances? If you've got Congress, if you've got the Supreme Court, if you can set the rules, if you can make and unbreak the laws, and nobody will respond to you, and nobody is responding to you, what are the checks and balances? That is exactly what we are about to see disappear, unless there is a huge wave of Democratic victories in the midterm elections. But we know perfectly well that the Republicans are going to do everything they can to prevent that from happening, and I don't just mean by winning votes. They are already in a process of taking away suffrage from large numbers of people in key states. So we are looking at a really very grim situation, and I don't think we should underestimate it and talk about checks and balances as an abstraction. The question is, what are the real checks and balances going to be? And they're essentially going to disappear.
Sonia Dridi, is the U.S. democracy in danger the way Christopher Dickey describes it?
I mean, I think it's a very important and dangerous moment for, I mean, the nomination of the new judge is going to shape the ideology of the nation. I think it's, you know, if they manage, and I think they will probably, to nominate the new judge before the midterm elections, even though the Democrats are really pushing for this not to happen. I mean, the right for abortion is in danger in 20 states, something like that. The Judge Kennedy also fought for the right for the LGBT community, and that will be in danger too. So I do think that the situation, I mean, I do think that the Democrats have reasons to be very worried, because between the I'm not sure. We're going to see how it's going to happen, what's going to happen for the midterms. But if the Republicans still dominate the Congress, and then indeed the conservatives dominate the Supreme Court, I think it's going to be a pretty unique moment in the U.S. So I already see. I mean, after my experience in Egypt, sometimes I'm a bit worried to see some of the thing I observe in a dictator after the Sisi took over, happening in the US. I do think also that, like in some other country, it was very interesting to see the civil society waking up. So, you know, we could have a huge protest like we had with the woman. And so we'll see what happened. I think it's very interesting to see the opposition in the streets becoming more important since Trump's election. But I do think Democrats have a lot of reasons to be worried.
No, I agree with you. You know, when I was covering the bid in Turkey to change it to an executive presidency, that's what every single supporter of the ruling AK party told me. Well, you have a president like that. And on this, I agree with you totally. You know, the control of executive, legislative, judiciary is absolutely alarming. The New York Times did a piece on how the Trump administration really worked to get this retirement before the midterm elections.
Let me just call up part of that article. The New York Times highlighting the cordial relationship between Trump and Kennedy, suggesting A, that Trump proxies, as Leila was saying, pushed Kennedy to announce his retirement as soon as possible, and B, that the president knows the judge's son, Justin, more than just a little. The younger Mr. Kennedy spent more than a decade at Deutsche Bank, eventually rising to become the bank's global head of real estate capital markets, and he worked closely with Mr. Trump when he was a real estate developer, according to two people with knowledge of his role. Is this a bit of conspiracy theories, though, that somehow, thanks to that, they convinced Judge Kennedy to retire sooner rather than later?
No, I mean, this is one in a long list of outreach that was being done. The biggest outreach was, of course, hiring Kennedy's legal clerks. So this is just one of them. But it points to a fact of this little elite circle controlling. But what is really important here, I think the issue is, we talk about it, the failure of liberal democracy. And for the longest time, when I would see Carter Center election monitors coming to all these countries to monitor the elections, I would always laugh at them and say, why don't you monitor the vote in Florida? I think now we've always known that there were problems with the U.S. system. We're seeing now the fall of liberal democracy. I think we just need to stop looking at the U.S. as, the answer to everything, because there are problems in the U.S. and that should come out. There's no reason for other countries to model themselves on the U.S. That's a myth.
Well, I think the core problem here is also Trump himself, because he doesn't share the basic values that have existed and have kept the republic going for a very long time. He basically approaches American government and his own power as a real estate magnate, and he deals with the world as he dealt with the real estate business. And everything is a zero-sum game. I make money, you lose money. That's the way it is. That's the problem. Going back to George Washington, you can point to one president after another who may or may not have had a good administration, but there were certain basic ideas that they shared and that were absolutely vital. And those had to do with checks and balances. Those had to do with the idea of what America was supposed to be. Trump doesn't share any of that.
Well, didn't a certain Richard Nixon push the envelope on that score?
Well, he pushed the envelope, but that's exactly the example I would cite. Richard Nixon, at the end of the day, understood what America was supposed to be about. He pushed the envelope. He abused a lot of things. He tried to use the CIA to stifle the FBI. All terrible things. But compared to what Trump is doing, it's nothing.
Right. This is true, but I mean, the thing is, there's also the danger of putting it down to one man. I mean, this is why, for instance, I tell people who have monarchies, like in Morocco, yes, you have a good king now, but what is your system in case someone like Trump or a bad king comes into power? Then, that's when you got to look at how good the system is. Why is the president hiring Supreme Court justices? The U.S. is really not a country where should a bad hombre get into power, you suddenly realize actually the system had no checks and balances. We were just relying on a president to understand.
We're relying on the goodwill of people, and we don't have it anymore.
I was wondering about your point where you said civil society might become more active. Do you think, given that all these branches of Congress, the judiciary, the administration will all be in the hands of Trump, do you think that perhaps civil society will say this is a reason for even Republicans to consider, I know America is very polarized at the moment, to consider not having every branch in the hands of Republicans?
No. I think that they will be absolutely impervious to huge marches in the street. I think that they're not going to pay any attention. And if that leads to violence, that'll serve their interests at the end of the day.
And I think in one respect, what stops people is Americans. And this most people who come into America realize a sort of deification of the American history, the American Constitution. So I think it's that much harder for, these mass protests to take in. In France, they'll toss the Republic, they put in a new constitution. Yeah. But, there is a sense that American democracy, with all its faults, this is the best in the world.
But there are definitely more and more protests, since Trump got elected. And I talked to so many people in their 40s, 50s that were going in the street for the first time. A lot of people that I meet in protests. And we don't talk about all the protests.
But will they go to the ballot box in November?
That's the goal. I think there is more and more. And I think that's what the Democrats have to really work on. Because also the Democrats, they've been a lot criticized by their own electorate, who say they don't go enough on the ground, they don't do enough for minorities, they don't.
There's a big generational divide.
But yeah, exactly. So I think it's very important that and I can see even some young Democrats working from now for the midterms. But let's look also at what happened with the crisis with the migrants, because there were so many backlash. Trump signed the decree, at the end.
He backed off on separating families.
It might not happen, especially that he really needs the support of the evangelical electorate, and that's why the evangelicals still support Trump despite of all of, his sexual scandals and all of what's happening is, his way of talking. They're waiting for the new judge, and he knows he needs this evangelical electorate.
All right, let's go south of the border. You'd have to go to the history books to find the last time the left was in power in Mexico. Come Sunday, Andrés Manuel López Obrador is almost certain to go from perennial loser to landslide winner. AMLO, as he's known, the 64-year-old former progressive mayor of Mexico City, a firebrand politician who's tapped into a general outrage in the country, outrage at violence and rampant corruption.
What we need now is to separate the economic power from the political power. A government that represents everyone, the rich and the poor. Not like what we have today. The government has become a select group at the service of a predatory minority.
Christopher Dickey, how do you explain the rise of AMLO?
He's speaking the truth about power. That is the way things run in Mexico. Mexico is I lived in Mexico for years, and it's a wonderful country, but the police are corrupt, the government's corrupt, and exactly the situation that he's describing is a real problem, that the links between the powerful economic interests and the powerful political interests are such that most people feel that they have no way up. And you add to that the incredible problems with the drug wars, the abuses that are entailed with those, the disappearances of people. There's a huge sense of insecurity in the country. And he's coming along and he's saying, the roots of the Mexican Revolution were on the left. We somehow lost that. We had the Revolutionary Institutional Party that ruled the country forever, then became incredibly corrupt and just was about holding on to power. Now we've got to take the country back. Now, whether he can do it, whether he has the stuff to govern effectively, that's a big question with López Obrador. But you can see why people would respond to it. And generally, there, as in the United States, there's often a feeling, hell, let's just throw all the cards up in the air and see what happens, because it couldn't be worse. It couldn't be worse than it is. That wasn't true in the United States. It was really not true in the United States. But it's very close to the truth in Mexico.
Having had the privilege myself, I can tell you that covering the World Cup is a reporter's dream. You travel to great places, you see great games, you meet great people from around the globe. So when I crossed on Monday to France 24 chief sports editor Ketevan Gorgistani, it certainly wasn't for this.
Hello, people. Hello, France. My name is Federico from Argentina.
No, Uruguay denying the Russians the top of this group. The Uruguayans were just much stronger in the first half by Luis Suarez, and there was an own goal by Denis Cheryshev. 2-0 at halftime for the Uruguayans. Russia, who of course saw one of their players sent off about 30 minutes in.
Now, the guy eventually went away, and Ketevan being the consummate professional, she soldiered on. By the end of her answer, we'd moved on to the subject at hand. In hindsight, I am sorry that I did not interrupt, if anything, to give real sports fans a chance to fully pay attention to her reporting. Ketevan revisited that incident in a tweet later in the week. Monday in St. Petersburg, sadly, this happens to us female sports reporters regularly, especially when covering football. By all means, sing, dance, and celebrate your team, but don't kiss me, don't grope me, and let me do my job. Your reaction, Sonia Dridi?
It makes me very angry. I think it's so bad to see that. I think it's terrible that people think they can do that, like give her a kiss in the neck. I mean, I think it should be punished. I think, you know, he should get a fine at least. I think it's very disrespectful. She's been very professional, and she could have been totally destabilized, and it would have been understood. But I think, especially with female journalists working in the sport field area, I mean, we're seeing another video now. I think it's terrible that some people think it's okay to do that, and I think there should be, you know, a campaign or something for this kind of behavior.
And you endured worse reporting for us in Tahrir Square in Cairo.
Yes, indeed, and it was a very different situation, and it's been, you know, on a different scale, of course. But I think, yeah, in general, that's harassment. What she, even though, like, you know, it was not on the same scale that what happened to me, I think it's as bad, it's as destabilizing.